Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Okay, we'll start in about 2 or 3 minutes, just getting the rest to join. Oh, I forgot to change my thumbnail. Okay, never mind. Minor issue. PogChamp. I should use Twitch. Okay, starting in 2 minutes. Do tell your friends to join. I think a lot are at CCA, so today is a bit different, but okay. Okay, there's something going on in the library today, so yeah, I'm trying to adjust the mic accordingly. Oh, is it very loud? Let me see how I sound. Okay, there's something going on in the library today, so yeah, I'm trying to adjust the mic accordingly. Okay, let's go. I hope this is better. Okay, let's go. I hope this is better. Okay, so today we are moving on to another chunk entirely. This is we are continuing UN peacekeeping, but we are moving on to the post-Cold War era. So that's what we are going to be looking at today. First of all, a reminder as to what is tested for your block test. So these are the details. Refer to the timetable given by the school, 2 hours, 15 minutes, one source-based and one essay question from a choice of two. For the source-based, Ms. Zakia has already told you the scope of coverage. For the essay question, yes, I have also told you. So that's pretty much the range of what will be tested up to the Secretary Generals. And also writing a full essay like we have been doing in class. Okay, I also have a movie coming up. Specific details to be confirmed, and everyone is greatly encouraged to attend. So this will be after the block test, and this one is quite accurate and can actually teach you a lot about one of the key case studies that we'll cover in the post-Cold War era, which is Rwanda. I'll also provide food if there's enough people. So yes, great. The breathing thing, I know why, but I need to leave it on for a while first because there's something videos that I need to play later. So after that is done, I'll shut all the outside noise except my mic. Then it should get better after that. Okay, first of all, let's start our day with our favorite Secretary General. I hope y'all can hear this. I don't know if I set it correctly, but I think I did. So yay. Let's listen.
I is here standing outside the
Tell me if y'all
United
cannot hear.
Nations of Benetton, which is where representatives from the three corners of the world come to end wars, international drug trafficking, and everything else that is a bit of a laugh. I is here with the geezer who was the Secretary General of the United Nations. His name be none other than my man, Boutros Ghali. How many countries is in the UN?
If I'm not wrong, according to the last statistics, you must have more than 180 countries.
Is Disneyland a member of the UN?
No, because Disneyland is not an independent state.
Do you think in 100 years' time, Disneyland or Disney World could have a seat?
No. Disneyland is not doing politics. Disneyland is doing...
Well, some of them is, some
Yes.
of them characters.
It is for the young children.
How many languages is spoken at the UN?
You have practically what we called 5 languages.
But which is the funniest language? It's French, isn't it?
Not necessarily. Maybe Arabic is more funny.
Oh, yeah.
It depends to whom.
To you, what was the one that when the delegate went up and started speaking, you was like, man, I got to go to the
I'm
phone.
not allowed to do this. I'm the Secretary General.
Yeah, but there must have been one when they were going up there, and you just go, hey.
I have to have a poker face like this.
Do you speak French?
Yes.
How do you say shit in French?
Chic.
Shit. Like crap, rubbish.
Ah. Oh, de la merde.
How do you spell that?
M-E-R-D-E.
M-A...
R-D-E.
Thanks for that. We want to say big up yourself, Boutros Ghali. Respect.
I am Boutros Ghali. Put down your gun and listen to
Bob Marley.
Bob Marley.
Yes. Boutros Ghali. Okay, why did I show you all that? Honestly, there is no real reason. I just felt like showing BBG, my favorite sec-gen of all. Yes, as you can see, he's actually quite a nice guy. Yeah, that's him being interviewed by Ali G, Sacha Baron Cohen, basically. Okay, now, back to our syllabus itself. So, we have already covered so far peacekeeping during the Cold War. So, we have looked at how the UN had a pretty mixed record during the Cold War era. For instance, the AI conflict, I mentioned that was quite mixed. Yes, they didn't really resolve it, but was it really their fault? Then, the Korean War, kind of hijacked by the US for its own foreign policy interests. The Suez Crisis, probably the only clear-cut success that we considered. Congo, again, kind of mixed, controversial. Issues of East-West divide, North-South divide, everything. Lebanon largely failed on the whole. So this, in a nutshell, is what we have covered so far when it comes to UN peacekeeping during the Cold War. Now, today we're going to move on to UN peacekeeping after the Cold War and our case studies for UN peacekeeping after the Cold War itself. Before that, as I said, we looked at different factors so far, a lot of different factors that affected how the UN conducted peacekeeping in the Cold War for issues like superpower rivalry, the US versus USSR, Cold War rivalry, whether they had a clear mandate, the willingness of host state, blah, 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 blah. And as we move into the post-Cold War era, that means 1991 to 2000 and onwards from that, I want you all to think about this one big question, which is, was the end of the Cold War a big turning point for peacekeeping? And this is very closely linked to our idea of change and continuity. Is that big change brought about by the UN after the end of the Cold War, as a result of the end of the Cold War, or was it just more of the same, just in a different form? And this really comes to the crux of the issue for this entire chunk on peacekeeping. Is the end of the Cold War actually a turning point for the UN and for peacekeeping in general? Or is it just like that? Actually, I love this meme page. This is actually, I can't remember the exact name on Instagram, something about A-level H2 history memes or something like that. Yeah, the guy who does it is pretty good. Or is it a case of the UN, after some initial successes in like the Gulf War and Cambodia in the post-Cold War era, thought that, yay, we can do a lot of things. And then Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Kosovo hits like a truck. Okay, some of the greatest failures of the UN in terms of peacekeeping came actually in the post-Cold War era. So that's really something to consider. Was the end of the Cold War actually a turning point for the UN? Or was it just continuities and the problems in a different form, but still the same problems that we always hear about? As a result, with the ending of the Cold War, we have to ask ourselves, did peacekeeping operations actually improve? That means all those issues that affected peacekeeping during the Cold War, did it actually get better? Cold War rivalry, the US versus USSR, the role of the SecGen, how always hindered by the Cold War rivalry, the willingness of host states to allow intervention, the political will, whether there is or isn't, issues such as finance, whether they have a clear mandate, the nature of the conflict. Did all these things actually become better in the post-Cold War era, or did it stay the same or might have even become worse? Okay, at this juncture, I'll stop for a while. I want to check on the sound quality because there's a lot of noise around me. There's some workshop going outside. Okay, appears the sound quality is still good, so I will proceed. Okay, moving on. So how does this fit into our overall syllabus? We are almost done with the UN actually. So this chunk, the peacekeeping chunk, today I'm going to look at peacekeeping case studies after the Cold War. Probably will take 2 lectures as well. And early in next term, we'll finish up the UN entirely. Okay, so these case studies that we are going to look at today, the post-Cold War era, all fall into this final part of the changing context of UN peacekeeping, the resurgence period, the final bit that we are looking at. And why do I call it resurgence? Is because most of the UN's peacekeeping missions, the vast majority of them came after the Cold War. Because peacekeeping had a renewed heyday after the ending of the Cold War. Suddenly the UN felt that, hey, peacekeeping can work, let's just try it everywhere on all the problems we have. It will work. Though, of course, it didn't turn out that nicely. First of all, similar to how I did the Cold War peacekeeping case studies, what I will do first is to set the context of UN peacekeeping in the post-Cold War era. That means from about 1989, the ending of the Cold War, or 1991, depending on how you see it. What's the context of UN peacekeeping in the post-Cold War era? Subsequently, I will then move into the specific case studies and see how many I can cover. Probably around 2 or 3 today. The Gulf War, the Cambodian-Vietnamese conflict, which you have heard about in Ms. Zakia's Southeast Asian lectures, and the Somalian Civil War. So these are the 3 that I hope to cover today. So without further ado, let's jump into the context of UN peacekeeping after the Cold War. Yay, the Cold War has ended. Is life actually better for the UN? You know, Reagan, Gorbachev, new thinking, yay, no more Cold War. Are things actually better for the UN in the post-Cold War era? And because if we look at it, there's no more superpower rivalry, only left with one superpower. No more anyhow vetoing each other. No more big wars. World peace. And my answer to that is fat hope. As you can tell, even till today, world peace is elusive. People always find reasons to fight each other, and countries are no different. So you wish. In fact, in the post-Cold War era, we actually see that there were more intra-state conflicts. Unlike the Cold War era where the UN dealt mostly with interstate conflicts, with the exception of the Congo, in the post-Cold War era, a lot of the conflicts that came out across the world were intra-state conflicts, which are inherently more complicated and honestly harder to resolve. So not an easy situation at all. And there are also more ethno-nationalist and religious conflicts. For instance, as a result of the breakout of the former Soviet Union, all these little constituent states all started fighting each other over ethnic reasons, religious reasons, nationalist reasons, and all that. There were also more sectarian secessionist conflicts. By sectarian, I mean communal conflicts, different ethnic groups against each other. Racial riots, genocides, ethnic cleansing, all these came to the fore as a result of the ending of the Cold War. There were also extremely chaotic and messy conflicts all over the world, with like no host state, no peace to keep, sometimes even no idea of who's fighting who, as we'll see in Somalia later on. And there was still a significant degree of big power rivalry on issues that affect their interests. You know, veto or threatening a veto on things such as Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and in the case of China on Xinjiang and all that. So it's not necessarily better when we enter the post-Cold War era. In fact, some would argue that it's even more complicated. So much so that, hey, with the ending of the Cold War, life is not necessarily better for the UN, but more complicated than ever. So much so that some people actually miss the good old days of the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, you knew who was fighting who. Capitalism, communism, US, USSR, it was so simple. While in the post-Cold War era, you have Somalia. Who is actually fighting who? Rwanda, ethnic cleansing, Kosovo. As Yugoslavia descended or split up into like 6 or 7 different states. So complicated compared to how life was so simple during the Cold War and all you need to worry about was, the US and the Soviet Union. So in a sense, the UN tried to respond to this under, for instance, Boutros Boutros-Ghali and his agenda for peace in expanding their peacekeeping functions towards peace building as well. More humanitarian efforts, more attempts to build peace in countries over time. Though, of course, this is to varying degrees of success. Okay, now let's move on to our case studies itself. 3 I'll cover today: the Gulf War, Cambodian-Vietnamese conflict, and Somalia. Now, for the Gulf War, even though I parked it in the post-Cold War era, you must note that it kind of straddles between both, because it's actually 90 to 91, which is literally at the ending of the Cold War period. So it's a bit debatable, and it depends on you how exactly you want to park it into the Cold War era or the post-Cold War era. But I feel that many of the features of the Gulf War probably are more representative of peacekeeping during the post-Cold War era, which is why I parked it in this post-Cold War thingy. Okay? So, first of all, the Gulf War. Where is this? And once again, we are heading to the Middle East. You notice that a lot of the case studies that we do are related to the Middle East. Okay, it's often seen as a powder keg region, with a lot of conflicts. So this one is on Iraq and Kuwait. If you look at the position of Iraq on the map, and Kuwait is the tiny little one to the southeast of Iraq, bordering the Persian Gulf as well. Again, some background on the Gulf War. So basically, what the Gulf War is about has a lot to do with the guy you see on the top right. Saddam Hussein, who you might or might not have heard of, depending on when you did social studies in school. First of all, Iraq has always claimed this little, country to its south, Kuwait, as part of their territory. And under Saddam Hussein, they wanted to dominate the Arab world, pan-Arabism and all that. And as a result of a war that they fought with Iran from 1980 to 1988, they were heavily in debt. And they tried to pay off their debt through their oil revenues. Iraq and Kuwait are both very oil-rich countries. However, oil prices at this point in time was falling due to overproduction by some other countries such as Kuwait, which Iraq accuses of producing too much oil and screwing everyone over by sending oil prices downward. And so, Iraq was increasingly pissed with what Kuwait was doing, even accused them of drilling into their oil fields from across the border. So as a result of all these mounting tensions between Iraq and Kuwait, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, eventually decided that he had enough. Demanded compensation from Kuwait. Kuwait refused, and he wanted to call on other Arab states to cancel Iraq's war debt. They did not as well. And so he saw no choice but to invade and occupy Kuwait as a result of all of this. So we see here what this is that this is a major interstate conflict. One country invading another and occupying it for a number of months. In this case, a bit like a big bully, because Iraq is many times the size of Kuwait and has a far bigger military. And then there's also this. In an attempt to get world opinion to his side, Saddam Hussein, for some strange reason, thought that it was a good idea to take some Western hostages and show that he was harmless through this very disturbing clip here. Yeah, where he went on Iraqi TV that was beamed across the whole world to fondle. Okay, not fondle, but he was trying to appear harmless to this bunch of little kids, little white kids, and let's just say that he appeared anything but harmless. He came across like a complete pedo. You can search for the clip, it's quite funny. Okay, in any case, as a result of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the UN obviously got involved. The UN Security Council met and immediately condemned the invasion. This was quite clear-cut, because one country invading another, this should not happen. So it was pretty clear-cut. They met, they immediately condemned the invasion through Resolution 660, demanding an immediate Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. Subsequent resolutions imposing a wide range of sanctions, and both superpowers agreed to do this. And the big reason for this is, if you remember, this is 1990-1991. What was going on 1990-1991? What was Gorbachev doing in foreign policy? Can someone give me the answer? 1990 to 1991, what was happening in the Cold War? What was Gorbachev trying to do? Yep, thanks. New thinking in foreign policy. And it was as a result of this that in this climate, both superpowers kind of agreed to condemn this unilateral invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. Okay, all of that, okay, also perestroika, glasnost, but given that we are talking about foreign policy in this case, we are looking more at what Gorbachev was doing in terms of his new thinking in foreign policy, which is desiring to build better relations with the West, trying to bring the Cold War to an end by ending tensions and all that. So it's in this climate that both superpowers agreed that they needed to deal with the situation in Kuwait collectively. So there was no disagreement in the UN Security Council at all, because the Cold War was effectively over by this point, with Gorbachev wanting to build better relations and all that, and his new thinking. Okay, further resolutions. So they started throwing more and more resolutions at Iraq to demand that they withdraw. Okay, you can read for yourself: air sanctions, maritime blockade, end to seizure of hostages, human rights breaches, blah 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 blah. It's like tossing resolutions at him, hoping that he obeys. Yeah, but for once, the UN Security Council was united in this. Let's spam resolutions at Saddam Hussein. Okay, however, Saddam was made of sterner stuff. Okay, and he didn't accede to any of the resolutions at all. So the UN Security Council issued one final ultimatum. Resolution 678. Basically, this is called the withdraw or else resolution. That means demanding that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait and its occupation of Kuwait by 15 January 1991, or else the UN will use all necessary means, including force, peace enforcement even, to force their compliance to this. Okay, Iraq did not withdraw. Saddam Hussein told them to go screw themselves. Okay, not exactly in that terms, but yeah, that was pretty much what he told them. And so, the UN, once again led by the United States of America. The UN, led by the US led a UN-sponsored coalition of 34 nations, the nations of the world, coming together under the banner of the UN, led by the US, to liberate Kuwait and force Iraq to surrender, in what became known as Operation Desert Storm. So this was a pretty spectacular conflict, because what the US did was literally bomb the shit out of Iraq. Okay, you can see some images there, and this was beamed into the living rooms of people all over the world, witnessing how the US was literally bombing the shit out of Iraq. And very soon, okay, after a massive area and ground assault led by the US, Iraq soon surrendered, accepted all the UN resolutions, and they declared a ceasefire on 28 February. Now, to some of you, this sounds very, very familiar. And I hope that many of you know that this should sound very, very familiar to another case that we have already covered. Many parallels here. Okay, so some images from Operation Desert Storm. After this, the UN deployed an observer mission there to kind of observe the situation and maintain the peace, UNICOM, monitor the ceasefire line and DMZ as per the Resolution 678, unarmed, it doesn't have much authority, and also an inspection regime to ensure Iraqi compliance with UN resolutions and to ensure that it destroys all of its dangerous weapons. So this was subsequently as a follow-up to what the UN did after the ceasefire. Overall, if we were to assess the effectiveness of the UN in the Gulf War, I would say that it was a big success for collective security. I mean, it's textbook collective security in the sense that, hey, poor little country gets bullied by a bigger one, gets invaded and occupied, the world bands together under our big brother, the United States, and helps this poor country and push back the invasion. So in a sense, it's a big success for collective security. But notice once again that I have those two inverted commas. Yes, Mr. Go is a bitchy person. So even though it was a success, but there were some things that made many countries around the world and many people around the world very uncomfortable with this entire episode. And the reason for this is as follows. So first of all, it's big success, there was widespread support, the entire Security Council agreed, no veto use, they took decisive action against an aggressor, but is this a case of peace enforcement rather than peacekeeping? And Is the UN's role that of peace enforcement? The perennial question comes back once again. And next up, did they act so decisively, especially the US, only because got oil? This is an important oil producing region. Is that the reason why they acted so decisively? There was political will. Everyone go, important region, we need to stabilize the place. And the huge influence the US had in dictating the flow of events really disturbed many countries. Yeah. Because after all, the question is, did what started out as a UN-sponsored coalition eventually turn into a US-led invasion? I'm very proud of this line. You'll notice that it kind of rhymes, So I'm going to repeat that at all of you. Did what started out as a UN-sponsored coalition eventually turn into a US-led invasion? Okay, something for all of you to consider. And finally, were UN goals once again hijacked by US foreign policy objectives? Notice I said once again, which is the other case where it's arguable that UN goals were kind of hijacked by US foreign policy objectives that you have already studied. Give me the answer. Okay, Yui raises a good issue, which is that how does the controversy affect the effectiveness of the mission? I would say that it doesn't, but as historians, we have to consider that even though it succeeds, it has repercussions beyond just the success. So, which is why I, put their success in inverted commas, but there was some controversy as a result of the way that the US once again did this whole thing. Yep. And finally, it also raises this very uncomfortable question. Does collective security only work if it is in line with US goals? That means this kind of beat back aggressor thing, does it only work when you have the big brother behind you in all this? The United States of America, which was the sole superpower in the world by this point in time in 1991. So big questions and no easy answers once again. Yes, I want your oil. Yes. Okay, and strangely similar to the Korean War, as I'm sure many of you have spotted the parallels already. US-led coalition under the banner of the UN, kind of successful but controversial in certain ways. The USSR is a big boy during the Cold War era, but this was in 1991. And in response to Rachel's question, by this point in time, the Soviet Union was crumbling. Yeah. Okay, so to wrap this up on the Gulf War, once again, I would like all of you to recall the different factors that we discussed that affected the UN's effectiveness in the Gulf War. And think about what were the key things that affected, how successful or not successful the UN was in this overall Gulf War. Moving on, the next one we'll look at is something that should be quite familiar to most of you, because it relates to Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, or the Cambodian-Vietnamese conflict, which, if you have been following Ms. Zakia's lectures, she has touched on as well. So this is the one where she said, Vietnam invaded Cambodia over long-standing animosities and border conflicts and all that. Okay, so for Cambodia, most of you should be quite familiar with where it is. I think some of you might have even been there before, quite close to us in Southeast Asia, over there, capital of Phnom Penh. And this one, why I said it's familiar to many of you, is because you have heard Ms. Zakia actually talk about this a bit when she covered Southeast Asia. So, in a way, this one is actually what was known as the Third Indochina War. There were three Indochina Wars. The first one was, decolonization. Ho Chi Minh fighting for independence from 46 to 54. After that, they split into North and South Vietnam. The Second Indochina War was the epic Vietnam War that we studied in the Cold War last year, where the US, the Cold War, and all those things got involved. The third Indochina War, which is this one, from 1978 to 1992, when the UN got involved with a peacekeeping mission, is actually what is sometimes called the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, where the Vietnamese invaded and occupied its neighboring country, Cambodia. So again, some background on this. The Khmer Rouge was the ruling party of Cambodia in 1975. It seized power in April 1975, which is the same year as the US pulling out of Indochina. 1975 is also the year that Vietnam was reunified. So 1975, in a way, is the year where all the dominoes in Indochina fell, one by one, to communism. And many of you are probably wondering by now, they're all communists. What's there to quarrel about? Why did Vietnam invade Cambodia? Aren't they like, communist brothers, bros, the brotherhood? Why are they invading and fighting each other? And the answer to this is that they never saw eye to eye. Communism is not a monolithic bloc. A phrase that you have probably heard both me and Mr. Lok say over the course of these last 2 years. So the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot did a lot of things that made many of the countries around it very uncomfortable, including Vietnam. So under Pol Pot, they attempted to turn Cambodia into a classless society, and his idea of a classless society is very interesting. His idea of a classless society is to depopulate all the cities, de-urbanization. Geog, you learn urbanization. He wants to de-urbanize, force everyone to go to the farms, force everyone to live in the countryside in agricultural communes so that everyone is equal. They're all peasants. Okay, I know I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. Yep. And as a result of this, what happened was what became known as the Cambodian genocide by Pol Pot. It was a horrible time for Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge regime from 75 to 78. Forced labor, mass starvation, torture, mass executions is an estimate that 25% of the Cambodian population died in these 3 years under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Yeah. Rachel is saying Pol Pot, my man. Yeah, I'm not sure why, but you seem quite fond of dictators and mass murderers. Oh, that's not very nice. Startup dark tourism. Okay. Anyway, yes, millions and millions died. 1/4 of the population of a country. Can you imagine that? It's like if you look around you, 1/4 of the people are gone with a snap of his fingers. Okay, maybe not exactly a snap, but you get the point. So a very, very devastating situation. Some images here of that. These are scenes today. I think not the reason of the genocide and all the bodies and skulls. If you go to Cambodia today, it's actually very sad. They have some genocide museums where they show all the victims that died as a result of the Pol Pot regime. Okay, it's a very solemn place. In fact, some would rank this Cambodian genocide as on par with the Holocaust in terms of mass murders of the 20th century. Yep. Anyway, beyond this, beyond what Pol Pot was doing at home, he was also busy pissing off Vietnam, the big communist brother to his right. And the reason for this is that there were a number of border conflicts and spats between Vietnam and Cambodia from 1977 to 1978. And furthermore, if we delve deeper in this, Cambodia has always traditionally feared its big brother Vietnam because of Vietnamese domination over the region traditionally, and also because of the Sino-Soviet split. One very simple way to understand why, even though they are all, communists, why do they disagree is due to the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s and 70s. The Chinese and the Soviets do not see eye to eye, and it just so happens that Vietnam and Cambodia are on different sides of the divide. Cambodia generally sides with China in the Sino-Soviet split, while Vietnam generally sides with the Soviet Union in the Sino-Soviet split. Okay, and this eventually escalated, tensions escalated into the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in December 1978, where Vietnam decided that they had enough of Pol Pot and his bullshit and invaded Cambodia. Very quickly, they occupied Cambodia and established a puppet regime led by Hun Sen. Who is this guy here? If you think he looks familiar, yes, he is. He is still the dictator of Cambodia today. And this is how many years? Yeah. Oh my god. 30? 40? Yeah, he has been around for donkey years, still ruling Cambodia. dictator for life in a sense. And recently, you know, the COVID thing, then the cruise ship that docked, that no one wanted to allow to dock, they docked in Cambodia and he started hugging them. Yeah, this is the guy, yeah. Okay. The People's Republic of Kampuchea, or the PRK, a puppet regime basically established by Vietnam after their invasion of Cambodia. Some further background, the situation was completely stalemated in the UN throughout the 1980s because both major sides, the Chinese on one hand and the West on one hand, and the Soviets and Vietnam on the other hand, recognized different governments as the legitimate government of Cambodia. The West and the China recognized the old Khmer Rouge, despite you know what Pol Pot did, as still the legitimate government of Cambodia, because you do not just anyhow invade people's countries and replace their governments. While on the other hand, the Soviets and the Vietnamese recognized this puppet regime led by Hun Sen, the PRK, as the legitimate government. So we have a spat here. Until the late 1980s, there was no real resolution to this. It was completely stalemated. And the only reason why it started being resolved in the late 1980s, once again, is linked to the international climate. Late 1980s is the ending of the Cold War. Tensions were toying around the world, and that includes this kind of old Cold War era conflicts. So once again, as a result of Gorbachev's new thinking, the thawing of ties between the US and the Soviets and the Chinese, a resolution became possible in the case of the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. They held a series of meetings, the Jakarta Informal Meetings, and finally, this culminated in the 1991 Paris Peace Conference, which agreed to split power between the different Cambodian factions. As a result of this, the UN was called in to transition Cambodia towards peace after many decades of war. UNCTAD, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, was sent to transition Cambodia to peace, disarm the various warring factions like Hun Sen's factions, and also the Khmer Rouge, and also one led by Prince Renarit, the Fun Sin Pact, and also to supervise and run the new government and supervise new elections until a new government can be formed. You know, hold free elections to create a new government. So yay, the UN goes in, help transition Cambodia to peace, hold elections, yay, great. This is also an example of peace building under Boutros Ghali, because it's not just keeping the peace, you know, after a ceasefire has been established and an agreement has been reached. It's also about building the peace for the long term by ensuring that there can be a new government, the new government is stable, help hold elections and all that. And overall, the UN was pretty successful in this. A huge and unprecedented undertaking by the UN that was quite successful overall. They managed to successfully run the country during this transition period. They oversaw Vietnamese troop withdrawals, they held free elections and fair elections that elected a new government, a power-sharing government between Renarit's Fun Sin Pact and Hun Sen's PRK. And they transitioned Cambodia to peace after decades and decades of long war. So great, pretty effective, and a successful undertaking. It also inspired a new generation of UN missions in the post-Cold War world, that they, beyond just keeping the peace, they can also build the peace. Peace building in all these conflict zones. It was a great time for the UN, the 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, the early 1990s. Because with the ending of the Cold War and all these successful missions, the UN felt that it could have a renewed and great role in this new world that was emerging after the end of the Cold War. But as you know, good things never last. So after these two kind of successful cases, the Gulf War and the Cambodia, came the three biggest epic failures of the UN ever, that one of my students in one of my classes called BSR. Bosnia, Somalia, and Rwanda. The three most epic failures of the UN came right after two nice successes in the post-Cold War era, which we will soon look at. Okay, but back to Cambodia. So successful overall, but still some criticisms. For instance, it was less successful in disarming the armed factions. The Khmer Rouge refused to accept the results of the election, and they continued to launch like guerrilla attacks and terror attacks in the countryside. Furthermore, long-term goals also not really successful. Hun Sen eventually staged a coup and took over for good, and he remains dictator of Cambodia till today. Possibly contributed to social problems too. Basically, there was a huge spike in HIV and AIDS in Cambodia after the UN mission there. you can kind of imagine what the UN peacekeepers did, feed prostitution and all those things. So yeah, social problems. But overall, this is probably still considered one of the more successful UN missions, especially compared to the string of truly epic disasters that you're about to hear about. So let's move on to the 3 epic disasters that I referred to: Somalia, Rwanda, and later on Bosnia, Kosovo. So, next up, we have the Somali Civil War. I wrote here 1992 to 93 and 93 to 95 because those were the UN missions there, but it actually dragged on way longer than that, even till today. It's still ongoing today, which is why this was, in many cases, an epic failure by the UN. Let's jump straight into it. This time, we are going back to Africa, and to a region known as the Horn of Africa, because it's on the east side, the tip of Africa there. Somalia, sorry. And some of you might have already heard of this country called Somalia before. I mean, Somali pirates? Heard of it? Somali pirates? There are movies on it as well. Yes, guess where they came from? They came from Somalia. As a result of the instability in Somalia over the last 2 or 3 decades, there's a lot of piracy in the seas around that region, which is actually a very important shipping route. So yeah, Somalian pirates. That's how the term came about. Also, some of you might have heard of or watched this movie before. Okay, it's actually my era, but some of you might have seen it before. Black Hawk Down. It's quite nice, quite well made. Yeah, starring all these people: Orlando Bloom, Tom Hardy, before they became famous. Yeah, they all started this. It's about Somalia and a particular battle, the Battle of Mogadishu, in the context of the Somalian Civil War. Okay, once again, let's provide some background to the Somalian Civil War. Shit, what's wrong with my pronunciation? Okay, never mind. So, as a result of this expansion of peacekeeping in a post-Cold War context with peace-building goals, and Boutros Ghali's ambitions for expanding peacekeeping after the successes in Cambodia, the UN felt that it was like a dawn of a new era. No veto cast at all from 1990 to 1993. It's like, wow, we can finally get things done. Peacekeeping can finally be successful. Peace building, an agenda for peace, Boutros Ghali and all that. The emergence of modern conflict resolution tools, a lot of things that the UN can use to, peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building and all that. All came together in Somalia. Many, many new missions in this period from the 1990s onwards. In comes Somalia. Unfortunately, the Somalian conflict was just super chaotic. Remember just now I mentioned that the post-Cold War world is actually a more complicated world. Very, very chaotic. And as a result of this ending of superpower support for their client states, many of all these states devolved into chaos in the post-Cold War world. Once the superpower conflict ended, once the superpowers stopped supporting different countries and different factions, a lot of these states descended into chaos and crumbled, and old rivalries and animosities once again came to the fore. During the Cold War in the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union supported Ethiopia, the US supported Somalia. But after the Cold War, US support was withdrawn from Somalia. And the regime that the US was supporting collapsed almost overnight. Replaced instead by a civil war between multiple factions. I only named 2 here, but there's 10 or 20 actually. 2 of the more prominent ones are the 2 factions headed by Ali Mahdi Mohammed and the infamous warlord Farah Aidid. So these are 2 of the more famous factions. On the request of the warring parties in this civil war, actually not all, some of them, the UN stepped in to try to resolve this conflict, the Somali Civil War. UNOSOM was established by the Security Council, the first one in 1992, to monitor the ceasefire, provide protection, deliver humanitarian supplies, the usual stuff. Yay, peacekeeping. Maybe it's going to be another Cambodia. Maybe we will succeed. Unfortunately, no. However, despite the establishment of UNOSOM, the situation in Somalia continued to deteriorate very badly. So the UN tried to strengthen its role there, expanded its mandate for its operations in Somalia. Through UNITAF, which is an armed force that was formed to ensure a safe environment for delivering aid, and an expanded mandate for UNOSOM, authorizing it to use force if needed to ensure its mandate. Accompanying this, the UN also got the US to support UNOSOM with a quick reaction force, an armed US military presence to help the UN and UNOSOM in Somalia. Unfortunately, the US wasn't particularly interested in Somalia, so they kind of agreed, but once things got sour, once the going got tough, they left really quickly. The Battle of Mogadishu, where the US forces clashed and were ambushed by forces of the warlord Farah Aidid, resulted in 18 US soldiers being killed. And after that, the US, bye-bye. Screw it. We don't want to lose any more of our boys to this country in Africa that we do not give a shit about. So the US started withdrawing its forces after that, and many of Western countries followed suit, and after that, the UN followed suit too. Okay, so it still didn't work, because most of the factions on the ground did not comply with UNOSOM's attempts to broker ceasefires, and member states and the UNSC, as I mentioned, also lacked the political will to support UNOSOM in its mission. I mentioned just now about how the US had no real interest. The US lacked political will to support UNOSOM. They started withdrawing their troops once things turned sour, and when the US started withdrawing, other Western countries followed suit. And after that, the whole UN force also followed suit. Withdrew in 1995, and there was renewed chaos and anarchy in Somalia. They just gave up. Withdrew without really achieving a resolution to this whole thing. Somalia becomes what we call a failed state. Till today, it's in a perpetual state of fighting and civil war. Lessened to some extent, but still, it has continued till today. A very, very sad situation, as you can see from images there. A failed state. Overall, if we were to assess the UN in Somalia, we see that it is a big failure. And why this was the case, it was once again a super complicated situation. It's like Congo times 5 in terms of its complexity. There was a lack of central authority in the region because I mentioned so many different factions, no host state at all, complete anarchy. Furthermore, none of the factions on the ground actually observed the ceasefire. They were unwilling to accept UN mediation and peacekeeping at all. They didn't give a shit about the UN being there. They continued shooting at each other and also often at the UN and the US forces supporting them. There was also, and most damningly, the lack of political will to do anything about Somalia. I mean, to put it bluntly, no oil, but that's simplifying it a bit. But yeah, most UN member nations, including the great powers, really had no real interest in Somalia at all. And yeah, the fighting between UN forces and Somali factions led to the death of many, many peacekeepers, and that just further soured all these countries that were contributing peacekeepers. Like, why are our boys dying in this faraway land which we don't give a shit about? And yeah, after 18 US soldiers lost their lives in the Battle of Mogadishu that I mentioned just now, they just started pulling out. One by one, the countries just started pulling out from Somalia. In response to UE's question, so there was a lack of host state consent for UN intervention? Yes, because there is no host state. If let's say there is 10 different factions, who's the host state? Who do you ask? Yeah. And yes, this led to a lack of respect for its mandate, because once you don't have agreement for the UN to be there, some of the factions won't really observe the UN mandate. And as a result of that, they also won't observe whatever the UN tries to do. So US announced its withdrawal from Somalia. By 1994, other countries soon followed suit. Very, very sad situation. And there was also a lack of a clear mandate. Some would argue that is a wrong diagnosis. The situation called for peace enforcement. Unpopular, but you needed to enforce peace. You needed to literally fight a war, or to actually force them to accept the UN there. Just peacekeeping and delivering aid. I mean, it sounds great, peacekeeping force, deliver humanitarian aid, but that does not suffice on its own. And so, this whole situation was just GG. However, let's not be too harsh on the UN. Once again, they were thrust into a situation where there was no peace to keep, and it was just simply too chaotic. We must also acknowledge that In the humanitarian aspect, the UN did manage to play a significant role. Deliver aid, brought relief to millions facing starvation, helped refugees, provided, and helped to stop certain large-scale killings and all that. But it did not manage to secure a lasting peace, or in fact, any sort of peace in the country. Didn't resolve the factional disputes, didn't manage to disarm the various militias, didn't manage to re-establish a viable government, but was it really their fault? Something to think about. Okay, so this is the final bit. So once again, recall your different factors that affected how well the UN conducted peacekeeping, and what were the key factors that, in your opinion, affected the effectiveness of the UN in Somalia. To wrap up, once again, what I've covered today is setting the context for UN peacekeeping in the post-Cold War era, and then looking at the different case studies of the UN during the post-Cold War era. There's a slight typo there. It should say a post-Cold War era, based on the 6 suggested case studies that I had for you. So today I managed to cover 3 of them: the Gulf War, the Cambodian-Vietnamese conflict, and the Somali Civil War. When we come back from the block exam, we'll finish off the remaining 3, and then there's 2 final lectures on the ICJ and UN reforms, and that's it for the UN. We are almost done. Okay, I hope you enjoyed today's live stream lecture. Thank you very, 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 very much, and all the best. Oh, do remember to complete the Exit Pass quiz. Okay, the Exit Pass quiz can be found on the History Google site. You can also access it from this link here. I will paste it into the stream right now. Okay, once again, 3 quick and simple questions. You can get a link from the History Google site, or you can get it from the live chat. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much, guys and girls. Bye. Have a good day.